On the 18th of this month, the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, will hold their annual conference in Brighton, England. And there they will be discussing the future of the whaling industry worldwide. Today's program looks at whaling and at the pros and cons of catching and killing whales. Hello, everybody.
Welcome to Issues in Focus.
At their last meeting, the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, voted in favor of a moratorium, that is to say a total ban on commercial whaling, to begin in 1986. Now, their reasons for doing that were that they wanted time to institute an accurate scientific survey of the state of whale stocks to make sure that they weren't being depleted. Naturally, their decision has affected Japan very seriously because Japan is today the major commercial whaling nation in the world. And Japan has, of course, as a result, objected to the idea of a moratorium. The Japanese whaling industry is a fairly small one. There are only about 1,500 people fully employed in it. But the Japanese maintain that whaling is a tradition, that whale meat is a traditional source of protein for them, and that they should be allowed to continue to whale. Well, now, this is obviously a scientific issue, but it's one that in the recent past has been clouded by emotionalism, as well as by some political pressures. For example, the threat of a boycott on goods produced by nations that insist on continuing to whale. Today, though, our program would like to look at this matter from a factual point of view. Well, Peggy, in order to help us do that, I think once again we have some charts which we'd like to begin by looking at. Could you, Peggy, explain what this first chart shows us?
As you can see from this chart of IWC members in 1983, more and more countries have joined over the years. The countries in red, like Japan and the USSR, Iceland, Brazil, are whaling nations. The IWC was founded in 1947 to collect data and set limits on the whale catch. It's in the interests of whaling nations to promote the effective use of whales, but not necessarily to wipe out the species. But now, as you can see from this chart, the majority of IWC members are non-whaling nations. Of the whaling nations, only Japan and the USSR are major commercial hunters of whales in the open ocean. By the way, countries like the USSR and Korea sell most of their whale meat to Japan.
So those countries we're looking at, the ones in white are non-whaling nations, the ones in red are whaling nations, but they are all members of the IWC.
That's right.
What does the second chart show us, Peggy?
When we talk about whales, we should bear in mind that there are many species of whales. As you can see from the chart, the big blue whale, which by the way is the largest animal that has ever lived on Earth, dwarfs some of the other smaller whales. The smallest is the Minke whale. These larger whales, like the blue whale, have been hunted almost to extinction. The IWC halted the hunting of these big whales, commercially that is, by about 1967. Now, virtually only the small Minke whale, this is the Minke whale, is taken in the open ocean by commercial fleets.
So of those 6 whales we're looking at on the chart, the 5 largest have been the subject of conservation for some years, haven't they?
Yes.
And now the IWC's decision on a moratorium really affects the Minke whale.
The topic of the coming discussions will probably be the Minke whale and whether to put a moratorium on that.
Okay, here's our third chart. Now, what does this show us, Peggy?
This shows us the catches of all the whaling countries of whales from 1947 until about now. As you can see from the lines for the big whales, for example, the red line for the sperm whale, it goes down to nearly 0. This reflects not only the halt that was put on taking these whales, but the actual decline in the numbers of these big whales, like the sperm whale and the blue whale. On the other hand, here we have the Minke whale, which wasn't taken commercially in these years. You have its catch coming along here in 1980.
Now, this catch is worldwide, isn't it, Peggy?
Yes.
Not just Japan. OK, well, as you can see from these three charts, it's a complicated subject, and neither Peggy nor I is a scientist, and we don't want to pretend to be. But our interview guest today is a scientist, and I'd like to introduce him now. He's Mr. Clive Nicol. Now, before he became a professional author, Mr. Nicol was Senior Marine Mammal Technician for the Fisheries Research Board of Canada. Mr. Nicol travelled in the Antarctic with the Japanese whaling fleet as an observer, and he's also lived in Taiji in Wakayama Prefecture, where he has observed this old traditional whaling port and its history, and has written extensively about it. I talked to Mr. Nicol, and let's hear what he has to say about the Japanese reaction to the idea of a moratorium.
For one, the whalers' main arguments is that whaling has been an industry in Japan for at least 800 years, providing the Japanese people with protein from the sea, with food from the sea. And they see no reason why this should be called to a halt. And the main arguments of the non-whaling countries is that the whales are in a decline, and this is an absolute falsehood. The whales are increasing, and the only whales being hunted pelagically, that's from a factory ship, are the Minke whales, and they're in great numbers. And I've seen that with my own eyes.
Yes, you have first-hand experience of examining whales, I think, in the Antarctic?
Yes, and in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. As far as the whalers are concerned, they are maintaining a tradition of a fishery which entails a lot of hardship for the men and for their families. It entails a lot of courage, and as far as they're concerned, they see no reason why they should suddenly have to stop hunting because of an emotional wave of protest that has been sparked off not by any scientific or any really good reason, but a wave of protest which has been fueled by anti-Japanese sentiments.
Well, whether the sentiments that fuel this wave of protest are anti-Japanese or not, they certainly reflect a world concern for conservation, not only of whales, but increasingly people in many countries are concerned about conserving stocks of other animals and plants as well as whales. It is an emotional issue from this point of view, and we would like to have a look at some film which shows very clearly the activities of some of the people who have taken an anti-whaling stance.
From the 1970s, whaling has become a political issue. Europeans and Americans have staged demonstrations against whaling. Whaling has also become a focus of anti-Japanese emotions. Here in London in 1978, those against whaling demonstrate and burn the Japanese flag. In another videotape from NHK Files, we see members of Greenpeace in the small motorboat interfering with the Soviet whaling fleet in the North Pacific. Greenpeace is a worldwide conservationist organization dedicating to stopping the killing of all animals, including whales. Organizations like Greenpeace want us to study, not kill whales.
Well, there we see one very emotional argument against whaling. Peggy, let's look at one of the Japanese arguments in favor of continuing to whale, this argument that it's a tradition in Japan. Isn't this also a slightly emotional argument in the sense that it involves national pride? Do you think it's a valid argument?
Well, it certainly is an emotional argument. I think traditionally, too, the Japanese have efficiently used the whales that they've hunted, but I think now the argument that it's traditional, we should continue to catch whales, is not a very valid one if whales, in fact, are nearing extinction.
Well, this whole question of the tradition of whaling in Japan is, again, a question that I put at some length to Mr. Nicol.
Earlier, Clive, you talked about the 800-year tradition of whaling in Japan. And sometimes this is put forward as a reason why the Japanese should continue to whale, because they have traditionally done so. But when you look at the history of Japan in the last, say, 100 years, you find that the Japanese have not been slow to discard those traditions that they found inconvenient. I mean, traditionally the Japanese wear kimono, but very few people now go to work wearing kimono. Traditionally they use brushes to write with, but few people now write business reports with brushes, if any. Do you think this argument that because whaling is a traditional industry in Japan, it should continue, really does hold water?
Just because it's a traditional industry, no, I agree. You know, if the Japanese themselves wanted to discard whaling, I'd be quite happy. But I think we do have many problems on this planet, and but the major problem is going to be protein for hungry peoples. And I see that whaling is a very, as a viable industry for providing protein for some people. And I don't see why, you know, you should say to the Japanese in fishing villages, you guys eat beef. But I don't think that other nations have any right to force an opinion on a nation about its food preferences. And the Japanese take whales in the high seas. They're not depleting the whale stocks. It's a traditional food source. And maybe even if there are only 100 people in Japan who still wanted to eat whale, I would say they had a right to eat whale.
You mentioned the importance of whale meat traditionally in the Japanese diet. Now, what about the other products that come from the whale? How have the Japanese used those?
Oh, my goodness. Well, all those, apart from protein, edible protein, all the other products can be made elsewhere. But the whale baleen was used, and it still is used, for the springs of bunraku puppets. Whale oil was used, as in the West, to light lamps. It was also used to make an insecticide for paddy fields. Whale sinews are used in armor making and, well, anything that needed really strong thread. And on and on and on and on and on. Bones were used for meal, for fertilizer. The residue of the cooked blubber was used for fertilizer, but mostly it's food.
I think in the 19th century, when the American whalers started whaling off Japan's coast, the wastefulness of the American whalers, who would kill a whale simply in order to, for the oil, without any intention of using most of the products that the Japanese had found traditional uses for. This wastefulness shocked the Japanese whalers.
Yes, it did, when they found out, And, you know, it was the American whaling industry, which was enormously powerful in the middle of the 19th century. It was this industry that lobbied to have Perry come over and forcefully open up Japan. Perry came not to open trade. He came to protect the American whaling industry. And it's amusing, I find, and that's absolutely clear. I have Perry's reports. It's amusing, I find, that here it's the mostly North Americans who are jumping up and down and saying how evil the Japanese are for whaling.
And yet you can, in a sense, you can trace the whole of Japan's modern history back to the whaling industry.
You can, yes.
Well, there we have historical and traditional arguments. Peggy, leaving aside the questions of history and tradition for a moment, is whaling cruel?
Well, some of the methods used to kill whales, for example, the cold harpoon, do seem to me to be cruel.
Now, the cold harpoon is a non-explosive harpoon, isn't it? It's just like a spear that goes into the whale. Yes, well, I put this question to Mr. Nicol, and he gave a very different view of the whole situation.
People have said that, for example, whalers continue to use the cold harpoons, the non-explosive or non-electric harpoons. The whale takes a long time to die. There are descriptions of large cow whales dying in great pools of blood and being held up, supported by other whales in the pack to prevent them drowning, and this has struck people as a very sad, a very tragic sight. In your experience of observing whaling, is it cruel?
I would say the killing of any creature is not a pleasant thing at all. And, you know, I don't want to try and evade the question, but I've seen slaughterhouses. And I think a slaughterhouse is more cruel because the animal knows well ahead that it's going to be killed and it is under great terror. Now, whales, nowadays, when the whale is chased, the chase doesn't last very long. And most of the whales I've seen killed are killed with one shot. Now, the cold harpoon argument is something rather typical of scientists and people who've not been aboard a whaling ship and seen what happens. Now, the Minke whale is a small whale, and now they've gone down to a 75mm harpoon, but even that, you know, that's a pretty big harpoon, and the bomb on the end of that harpoon is about this big, right? Mm-hmm. Which is several times more powerful than a hand grenade. And when they hit a whale, and most of the whales I saw were hit with a heart shot, the whale tends to rear up out of the water like this, you see? Mm. And the harpoon often goes right through. Mm. The whale is dead, the harpoon's gone right through the chest cavity, and it explodes in the air. The bomb explodes in the air, and that throws shrapnel all over the place and very severely endangers the lives of the men on the ship. Mm-hmm. Now, the companies, the whaling company will say, we don't want you to use the bomb because it'll ruin meat. Mm. But the whalers themselves, especially the gunners, and if you think that Japan had hundreds of whale gunners and that only a few are left now, the ones that are left are superb shots. Mm. They don't want to use a bomb because of the danger to their men.
So the whaler's argument would be in favor of the cold harpoon?
Definitely, and my argument is also in favor of the cold harpoon because the bomb doesn't do much in a Minke whale. Mm. It really doesn't. Mm. And a Minke whale is not a very big whale, and I hate to see animals dying or people dying. Like anybody who's against whaling. But the whale is hit. It's pulled right up to the bow very quickly. And if it's still alive, its heart is bracketed either side by electric lances. And the gunner presses a button and it's dead.
Whatever the arguments pro and con on methods like the cold harpoon, don't you think that because whales are so intelligent, they shouldn't be killed?
Well, certainly, this is an argument that's often raised. Peggy, I'm not a scientist, and only a scientist can tell us very much about the intelligence of a creature like the whale. It's said that the whale is not only intelligent, but that its social organization is very advanced. It has an advanced form of communication. It's harmless to man, of course, unlike some other conserved species or species which are on conservationists' lists, like tigers and rhinoceroses. These, again, can tend to be emotional arguments, but it certainly is said that the whale is an intelligent, advanced creature, and this is an argument against whaling. This is another question I put to our scientist guest, Mr. Clive Nicol.
There is some scientific evidence, isn't there, that whales are very intelligent creatures, and this includes their cousins, the dolphins and the porpoises. Some people have even gone so far as to say that next to man, whales may be the most intelligent creatures on Earth, and people have put this forward, again, as a good reason for not killing them. The fact that we could probably learn more from them if we kept them alive and befriended them. How do whalers react to this argument?
Well, if you're going to have a scale of intelligence as to whether you can kill an animal because it's intelligent or not, you're getting very close to Nazi philosophies. It's intelligent, or it's of a superior race, therefore you don't kill it. But it's okay to kill horses, or it's okay to kill dogs, Or, no, you mustn't kill dogs, but it's okay to kill foxes. I just don't accept that as an argument, that the whale is too intelligent to kill. The whale is, to me, a protein source. Now, personally, I think this moratorium is creating a lot of fuss for nothing, because the Whaling Association is going to get angry with me, but I think the Antarctic whaling is as an industry, is doomed anyway.
For what reason?
For what reason? For the simple fact that Japan has only one factory ship, and she's what, 45 years old? She's a wallowing old pig of a ship. She can only make 10 knots at full speed, and to replace her would cost at least I think of Japanese when I think in yen, but 150 oku, maybe 200 oku yen, which is many billions of yen, isn't it? To replace her. And I don't see any industry in Japan building the kind of a new factory ship. I think the whaling will continue in Japan as a coastal industry.
Well, I think it's important to emphasize here that the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, was founded to survey, to collect data on whales, particularly now the Minke whale, in order to assess the state of their stocks and to decide whether or not the species is endangered. But how do you count whales?
That's a problem.
They're in a completely different environment from man, and this must be a very considerable scientific problem. How do you determine whether, as a species, they're endangered or not? Well, we have some film which shows how this IWC survey is in fact conducted.
In 1976, the IWC embarked on a program to assess minke whale stocks under the auspices of the International Decade of Cetacean Research. A major objective of the program is to directly and more accurately estimate the number of the minke whales in the Antarctic. The Japanese government has made a major contribution to this research by providing ships and helping to organize annual expeditions to the Antarctic seas by groups of international observers. The research cruises take place during the southern summer, when minke whales migrate to the Antarctic. During the 1978-79 season, the first expedition studied Area 4. This was followed by Area 3 in 79-80, Area 5 in 80-81, and Area 2 in 81-82. A film record was made of the third expedition to Area 5. On this occasion, 3 research ships were made available, 2 from Japan and 1 from the Soviet Union. The research team was led by Dr. Peter Best of the Sea Fisheries Institute, Cape Town, South Africa. It included 9 more scientists, 3 from the USA, 3 from Japan, and 1 each from Australia, New Zealand, and the Soviet Union. 2 main techniques are employed for assessing whale stocks, known briefly as marking and sighting. The method of marking involves firing numbered steel shafts into live whales at a point where the marker will not cause harm to the whale. Different guns and markers are designed for firing at larger or smaller whales. The shafts are sterilized before use. When a whale has been sighted, the ship is steered as close as possible, and the marksman prepares to fire. Not always an easy task to hit a suitable part of a moving whale from the deck of a moving ship. A careful tally is kept of the number of whales successfully marked as well as the number of misses, ricochets, and possible hits. These figures are later compared with the number of whales which are captured, with and without markers, in order to provide an estimate of the total.
Well, Peggy, we've seen two sides of a very controversial coin today, haven't we? In a sense, we've seen people burning flags and shouting on the one hand, we've seen serious scientists conducting serious surveys on the other hand. How do we conclude our program? It's a question of balance, isn't it?
Yes, I think you're right. There are, of course, pros and cons to every argument. And the Japanese may have a point that there's a lot of anti-Japanese emotionalism and politics by a lot of non-whaling nations involved in the issues of setting quotas on whales. But on the other hand, whales, if we make a mistake and wipe them out, there's no going back and then saying, well, now let's study them. It's something that really should be approached with great caution and conservatism.
And with, as we say, balance. Well, that's all we have time for on today's program. Until we see you again in September on Issues in Focus. Goodbye from us and have a good summer.
Goodbye.